We'll be starting Chapter 17, Psychiatry, the Drug Industry's Paradise. There is probably no other area of medicine in which the academic literature is so at odds with the raw data. David Healy, psychiatrist. Leaving the determination of whether mental illness exists strictly to psychiatrists is like leaving the determination of the validity of astrology in the hands of professional astrologers. People are unlikely to question the underlying premises of their occupations, in which they often have a large financial and emotional stake. Judy Chamberlain, former mental patient. I have spent most of my professional life evaluating the quality of clinical research, and I believe it is especially poor in psychiatry. The industry sponsored studies are selectively published, tend to be short term, designed to favor the drug, and show benefits so small that they are unlikely to outweigh the long term harms. Marcia Angel, former editor, New England Journal of Medicine. Are we all crazy or what? Psychiatry is the drug industry's paradise as definitions of psychiatric disorders are vague and easy to manipulate. Leading psychiatrists are therefore at high risk of corruption, and indeed, psychiatrists collect more money from drug makers than doctors in any other specialty. Those who take most money tend to prescribe antipsychotics to children most often. Psychiatrists are also educated with industry's hospitality more often than any other specialty. This has dire consequences for the patients. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, from the American Psychiatric Association, APA, has become infamous. It is now so bad that Alan Francis, who chaired the task force for the DSM 4, which lists 374 different ways to be mentally ill, up from 297 in the DSM 3, believes the responsibility for defining psychiatric conditions needs to be taken away from the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. Francis has warned that the DSM 5 could unleash multiple new false positive epidemics, not only because of industry money, but also because researchers push for greater recognition of their pet conditions. He noted that already the DSM 4 created 3 false epidemics because the diagnostic criteria were too wide. Attention deficit, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism, and childhood bipolar disorder. According to Francis, the new diagnoses are as dangerous as new drugs. We have remarkably casual procedures for defining the nature of conditions, yet they can lead to tens of millions being treated with drugs they may not need, and that may harm them. Drug regulatory agencies should therefore not only evaluate new drugs, but should also oversee how new diseases are being created. The confusion and incompetence is so great that the DSM 4 cannot even define what a mental disorder is. I have highlighted in italics some of the wishy washy bits of the definition. A clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual that is associated with present distress. For example, a painful symptom or disability. In other words, impairment in one or more important areas of functioning, or with a significantly increased risk of suffering death, pain, disability, or an important loss of freedom. In addition, this syndrome, or pattern must not be merely an acceptable and culturally sanctioned response to a particular event, for example, the death of a loved one. Whatever its original cause, it must currently be considered a manifestation of a behavioral, psychological, or biological dysfunction in the individual. Neither deviant behavior nor conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict is a symptom of a dysfunction in the individual. What? It would be easy to improve on all this ambiguity and subjectivity and arrive at a more meaningful and robust definition. The DSM is a consensus document, which makes it unscientific. The Royal College of Physicians doesn't seek website comments from the public on the diagnosis of breast cancer, and real sciences do not decide on the existence and nature of the phenomena they are dealing with via a show of hands with a vested interest and pharmaceutical industry sponsorship. Homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder till 1974 when 61% of the physicians voted to have it removed, only to retain something called ego dystonic homosexuality for those who felt uncomfortable about others' condemnation of their sexual orientation. Psychologist Paula Kaplan was involved with updating the DSM to its fourth edition, and she fought hard to get the silliest ideas out. In 1985, the APA decided to introduce masochistic personality disorder to be used for women who were beaten up by their husbands. Kaplan and her colleagues felt the proper response to this should be macho personality disorder for the violent males, but they settled with delusional dominating personality disorder. They suggested to the APA committee that this would apply if a male fulfilled 6 of 14 criteria, of which the first was inability to establish and maintain meaningful interpersonal relationships. The chairman, Alan Francis, asked what the empirical documentation was for this disorder and warned that it would be folly to open the floodgates to new and unsupported diagnoses. An interesting remark considering what was already included in the DSM 3. The people who developed the DSM have heavy conflicts of interest, and creating many diagnoses mean big business in all sorts of ways and frame and power for many diagnoses. Oh, fuck. Starting over. These people who developed the DSM have heavy conflicts of interest and creating many diagnoses, meaning big business in all sorts of ways, and frame and power for those at the top. But does it help people to be labeled? Some of us still remember minimal brain damage dysfunction, which was thrown in the faces of millions of parents and which could only be harmful, as there was nothing they could do, whatever the problem was, if any. Other elastic diagnoses that could be used for most healthy people are oppositional defiant disorder for children and self-defeating personality disorder for women. Labeling women with premenstrual dysphoric disorder might prevent them from getting a job or have custody of their children in case of a divorce. When the criteria for this diagnosis were tested, it turned out they couldn't distinguish between women with severe premenstrual symptoms and other women. Even men gave answers similar to those with severe symptoms, but who cares? The FDA obviously didn't. It approved Eli Lilly's antidepressant Prozac, fluoxetine, for this non disease, which the US psychiatrists even had the gall to call depression. Lilly had the audacity to give the drug another name, Seraphim. Sounds like a fucking angel. Which was a repainted Prozac with attractive lavender and pink colors. Pretty ironic to use pink as a symbol for a pill that ruins people's sex lives. Since men have the same symptoms, it would seem okay to treat them too. In Europe, Lilly was forbidden to promote fluoxetine for something that wasn't considered a disease, and the EMA fiercely criticized the company's trials, which had major deficiencies. The Cochrane review of this non disease included 40 trials, and the SSRIs were said to be highly effective. Of course, SSRIs have amphetamine like effects, and some people feel better when they take speed. Of course they do. Few psychiatrists are willing to admit that their specialty is out of control, and they will continue to tell you that many patients are undiagnosed. This is their standard defense. But under the glittering surface, they know they and their patients have a big problem. In a 2007 survey, 51% of 108 Danish psychiatrists said that they used too much medicine, and only 4% that they used too little. In 2009, sales of drugs for the nervous system in Denmark were so high that 1/4 of the whole population could be in treatment every day. And yet, Denmark comes out as the most happy nation on earth in poll after poll, despite our terrible weather, which should make people depressed. In the United States, it's even worse. The most drugs sold in 2009 were antipsychotics, and antidepressants came fourth after lipid lowering drugs and proton pump inhibitors used for stomach problems. It's hard to imagine that so many Americans can be so mentally disturbed that these sales reflect genuine needs. But it gets worse all the time, and with alarming speed. In 1991 through 92, 12% of the US population aged 18 through 54 received treatment for emotional problems, which went up to 20% in 2001 through 2003. Although there are hundreds of diagnoses in the DSM 4, only half of people who were in treatment met diagnostic criteria for a disorder. In 2012, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control reported that 25% of Americans have a mental illness. Not even our children have avoided the disease mongering. New Jersey, 1 in 30 boys is considered to have autistic spectrum disorder, and about a quarter of the children in America's summer camps are medicated for ADHD, mood disorder, or other psychiatric problems. 1 in 4, and we are talking about children. As early as the 1990s, a quarter of the children in an elementary school in Iowa were on drugs for ADHD. And in California, the diagnosis rates for ADHD increased sharply as school funding declined. About 1/5 of doctors didn't follow the official protocol when making the diagnosis, but rather their personal instinct. Psychiatry is really elastic and has replaced care with pills, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Drugs for ADHD have amphetamine like effects. That the children can sit all that, that the children can sit still at school cannot be taken as evidence that the diagnosis was correct. It merely shows that speed has this effect, and many others, including apathy, lack of humor, and social isolation. In 2011, an enterprise, evidently working on behalf of an anonymous drug company, sent a most bizarre invitation to Danish specialists treating children and adolescents for ADHD. The doctors would be divided into two groups for an exercise called War Games, where they should defend their product, two different ADHD medicines with arguments and visual presentation. Their efforts would be filmed, and the company's anonymous client might be watching from another room what went on. This Big Brother is watching you exercise was illegal. Danish doctors are not allowed to help companies market their products. Drugs for ADHD are dangerous. We don't know much about their long term harms, but we do know that they can damage the heart in the same way as seen in long term cocaine addicts and lead to death even in children. We also know that in ADHD, drugs cause bipolar disorder in about 10% of children, which is a serious condition. In 2010, a Centers of Disease Control and Prevention published a report stating that 9% of the interviewed adults met the criteria for current depression. The criteria were those listed in the DSM 4, and very little was needed. You were depressed if you had little interest or pleasure in doing things for more than half of the days over the past 2 weeks, plus one additional symptom, which could be many things. For example, trouble falling asleep, poor appetite, or overeating, being so fidgety or restless that you have been moving around a lot more than usual. This is insane. How on earth did we get to this point of accepting a system that labels 1/10 of the US adult population as depressed at any one time? Are people who do this to us normal, or should we invent a diagnosis for them? For example, compulsive disease mongering disorder? Little pleasure in doing things for 8 days out of 14 will happen for most people, no matter how positive, active, and outgoing they are. Trouble falling asleep is common. Many people overeat. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an obesity epidemic. And people might move around more than usual if they succeed with something they badly want to achieve. With such an approach to diagnosis, it's easier to understand why the rate of depression in the population has increased 1,000-fold since the days when we didn't have antidepressant drugs. According to the DSM 4, I have been depressed many times in my life, but according to myself and those who know me, I have never been anywhere near being depressed. Alan Francis found it alarming that 1/10 of Americans were considered depressed and felt that the prescription of antidepressants is increasingly out of control because it is controlled by drug companies who profit from it being out of control. He also noted that the DSM 5 will further increase overtreatment for generalized anxiety disorder and introducing new and highly questionable disorders for mixed anxiety, depression, and binge eating. It is really perverse. All of us will experience the death of a close relative, but in the DSM 5, bereavement is a depressive disorder if it has lasted more than 2 weeks. In DSM 3, that period of time was set at 1 year, and in the DSM 4, it was 2 months. Why not 2 hours in the DSM 6? We should allow people to be unhappy at times, which is completely normal, without giving them a diagnosis of depression. Over the years, many new disorders have been included and existing disorders exploded. For example, in DSM 3, anxiety neurosis was split into 7 new disorders. Another change was the introduction of a symptom based approach for diagnosis, which has been criticized for creating diseases and for classifying normal life distress and sadness as mental disease in need of drugs. Criteria for depression no longer distinguish between the disorder and expected reactions to a situational context, for example, the loss of a beloved one or another life crisis like divorce, serious disease, or job loss, which are no longer mentioned as exclusion criteria when making the diagnosis. These changes, which are so generous towards the drug industry, could be related to the fact that 100% of the DSM 4 panel members on mood disorders had financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. The psychiatrists are running amok. The DSM 5 committee have had plans for lowering the diagnostic thresholds for many other conditions. For example, for ADHD and attenuated psychosis syndrome, which describes experiences common in the general population, but the latter diagnosis was dropped. An international protest has been launched against DSM-5, and even their chair of the DSM-3 task force, Robert Spitzer, is critical towards the major revisions of personality disorders, which often lack any empirical basis. After my depressing experience with the DSM-4 criteria for depression, I looked up Psych Central, a large website that had been highly praised by neutral observers and had won awards. It offers many tests, even including one for psychopaths, and its slogan is, "You're going to be okay. We're here to help." It's comforting to know that if you break down under the weight of the diagnoses after having tried some of the tests, the website offers immediate access to a psychiatrist. You can read about psychotropic drugs and find out which codes in DSM 4 may be appropriate for you. A little experiment I did suggests that there is a diagnosis for each of us. We were 8 perfectly normal and successful people that tried the tests for depression, ADHD, and mania, and none of us survived all 3 tests. 2 had depression, and 4 had definite, likely, or possibly ADHD. 7 of us suffered from mania. 1 needed immediate treatment, perhaps because she has written a book critical of the drug industry. 3 had moderate to severe mania, and 3 had milder degrees. It's not the least surprising that when the therapists have been asked to use DSM criteria, a quarter of healthy people also get a psychiatric diagnosis. One of the new epidemics is bipolar 2. Unlike bipolar 1, it has no mania or psychotic features, and the diagnostic criteria are very lenient. There only needs to be 1 episode of depression and 1 episode of hypomania lasting more than 4 days. This opens up the floodgates for treating vast numbers of patients with antipsychotic drugs, resulting in tremendous harms at huge costs. Even the very old drugs, quetiapine, costs a staggering £2,000 a year in the UK in 2011. The diagnosis of hypomania builds on simplistic questions, one of which is, "I drink more coffee." In trials, bipolar 1 and 2 are mixed together so that one cannot see whether antipsychotics have any effect in bipolar 2, which is supposed to be milder. A smart marketing trick. Bipolar illness in children rose 35-fold in 20 years in the United States. It's not only the loose criteria that caused this disaster, both selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and ADHD drugs cause bipolar illness, and both types of drugs may lead to conversion of a depression or ADHD, respectively, into bipolar disorder in 1 out of 10 young people. However, psychiatrists hail this as better diagnosis, or they add insult to injury by saying that the drug unmasked the diagnosis. Even the characters in Winnie the Pooh have been found to suffer from psychiatric disorders. For example, Little Piglet obviously suffers from generalized anxiety disorder, and the donkey Eeyore from a dysthymic disorder. There is a substantial risk of circular evidence in all this. If a new class of drugs affect mood, appetite, and sleep patterns, depression may be defined by industry supported psychiatrists as a disease that consists of just that, problems with mood, appetite, and sleep patterns. UK general practitioners Des Spence has described eloquently how psychiatry has become so corrupted. Psychiatry has becomes pharma's gold mine with a simple business plan. Seek a small group of specialists from a prestigious institution. Pharma becomes a professional kingmaker. Funding research for these specialists. Research always reports underdiagnosis and undertreatment, never the opposite. Control all data and make the study duration short. Use the media, plant news stories, and bankroll patient support groups. Pay your specialists large advisory fees, lobby government, get your pharma sponsored specialists to advise the government. So now the worldview is dominated by a tiny group of specialists with vested interests. Use celebrity endorsements to sprinkle on the marketing magic of emotion. Expand the market by promoting online questionnaires and loosen the diagnostic criteria further. Make the illegitimate legitimate. Spence mentions that a small Harvard group of world specialists admitted undiagnosed personal payments from drug companies totaling $4.2 million. A review of 43 studies in ADHD, of which 34 were randomized supporters. Spence Kingmaker Tale. Very few of the reported adverse drug reactions were called serious, although many children dropped out of the studies because of precisely that, serious drug reactions. A large number of studies were conducted by the same groups of authors and sponsored by the companies manufacturing drugs. Not a not set up not a setup that is likely to tell us the true occurrence of serious harms. Many of the studies are also rigged, either by dropping all children who improved on placebo before the trial starts, or opposite, studying only children who have tolerated the drug before they are randomized to drug or placebo. Such manipulations are very common in trials of psychotropic drugs, also on trials of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they make people think the drugs are much better than they really are. Some trials even use both types of patients. Some trials even use both types of patient cleansing before they are randomized. Psychiatrists as drug pushers. Leading psychiatrists are often highly effective drug pushers. In 1999, Charles Nemiroff and Alan Schatzberg published a psychiatric textbook that was ghostwritten by GlaxoSmithKline. In 2006, Nemiroff was the first author of a review on the effectiveness of vagal nerve stimulating devices for the treatment of severe depression. A truly weird idea. The paper was ghostwritten and published in the journal Nemiroff edited, and all authors had financial ties to the device, but makers were not revealed. The FDA approved the device based upon a senior manager overruling more than 20 FDA scientists, as well as other managers who had received the data and concluded that the device didn't demonstrate a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. There was also corruption at Emory University where Nemiroff worked. Excuse me. Hello? What? Um. Oh, the Molly bolts for the mom's pictures. Tarps, Molly bolts. Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember. Oh, fish guts. Right. Sorry about that. Moving on. Where were we? The FDA approved the device based on a senior manager overruling more than 20 FDA scientists as well as other managers who had reviewed the data and concluded that the device didn't demonstrate a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Okay, that's where we left off. There was also corruption at Emory University, where Nemiroff worked, and at the closely affiliated hospital, Grady Hospital, but it was kept secret for more than a decade. In 2008, Senator Charles Grassley released a damning report about Nemiroff that showed that one reason why the scam could continue for so long was that the whistleblower, at least 15, were ordered psychiatric evaluations at Emory's psychiatric department. Emory's own chosen psychiatrist reportedly wrote up such exams without even examining the targeted doctors or gathering factual evidence, whereafter several of them were fired. I wonder how these same psychiatrists conduct clinical trials for the drug companies. At least 4 of the evaluations were done by Nevrov himself, which made the processes similar in nature to Stalin's processes in the Soviet Union. The staunchest whistleblower who sat at the Conflicts of Interest Committee at the Emory University refused to get an evaluation after he had blown the whistle on alleged research funding fraud, and he became the victim of more than 12 years of continuing litigation, which he untimely won. In 2000, an antidepressant trial was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where the authors had so many conflicts of interest that there wasn't room for them in the journal. Instead, they were listed on a website. The conflicts of interest for 3 psychiatrists common in this book were: Dr. Nemiroff has been a consultant to or receive honoraria from Abbott, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, Forest Laboratories, Janssen, Eli Lilly, Merck, Mitsubishi, Neurocrine Biosciences, Oregon, Otsuka, Pfizer, Pharmacia, Upjohn, Sanofi, SmithKline, Beachem, Solvay, and Wyeth Arist. He has received research report from Abbott, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, Forest Laboratories, Janssen, Eli Lilly Organization, Pharma, Pharmacia, Upjohn. Why did it do that? Why did it do that twice? I don't know. And Wyeth Irist. Dr. Skatzberg has served as a consultant to or received honoraria from Abbott, Bristol Myers Squibb, Corcept Therapeutics, Forest Laboratories, Janssen, Eli. Oh, I'm not reading all this shit. Moving on, the trial gave rise to an editorial with the title, "Is Academic Medicine for Sale?" One wonders when these people have time for seeing the patients. People who take money from many companies usually argue that they are not in the pocket of the industry because they are not dependent on any particular company. Accepting this line of reasoning, it should be quite okay to be a prostitute as long as you make sure you have many customers every day so that you aren't dependent on any particular one. Psychiatry is in deep crisis. It has not only turned what we it has not only turned what were previously acute conditions chronic, it has also medicalized normality. Psychotropic drugs are being used for the most bizarre ailments. For example, a trial showed that es- esh- escital- escitalopram reduced the daily incidence of hot flashes in menopause women for 10 to 9, from 10 to 9. This tiny effect might even be non existent, as many women have broken the blind as they can feel the difference between SSRI and placebo. Considering the many effects psychotropic drugs have, their massive use is harmful. For example, a carefully controlled cohort study of depressed people over 65 years of age showed that SSRIs more than often lead to falls and that SSRIs more often lead to falls than older antidepressants or if the depression was left untreated. For every 28 elderly people treated for 1 year with an SSRI, there was one additional death compared to no treatment. Instead of trying to understand, oh wait, the chemical imbalance hoax. Instead of trying to understand the patients, psychiatry has developed into checklist exercise, which one could ask a secretary or the patients themselves to do. Diagnoses are often made after brief consultations of 10 to 15 minutes, after which many patients are told that they need a drug for the rest of their life to fix a chemical imbalance in the brain. Very often, they are also told that this is similar to being a patient with diabetes needing insulin. If this were true, the number of disabled mentally ill would have gone down after we introduced the antipsychotics and antidepressants. But instead, the number of people with psychotic diagnoses and disability pension has skyrocketed. Worst of all, this has also affected our children. In 1987, just before the SSRIs came out on the market, very few children were disabled mentally ill in the United States. 20 years later, it was more than 500,000, which was a 35-fold increase. World Health Organization studies have shown that the patients far much better in parts of the world where psychotropic drugs are little used. For example, in poorer countries where only 16% of patients with schizophrenia were regularly maintained on antipsychotics as compared with 61% in rich countries. The positive results have been confirmed in Finland, where drugs used was restricted so that only 20% of patients with schizophrenia took antipsychotics regularly, and two-thirds were never exposed to drugs. In the United States, researchers who arrived at similar results experienced that their funding from the National Institute of Mental Health and elsewhere dried out. The news were not welcomed by the psychiatric leaders. The chemical imbalance story, which is being told about all psychotropic drugs, even for benzodiazepines, nerve or sleeping pills, is a big lie. It has never been documented that any of the large psychiatric diseases is caused by a biochemical defect, and there is no biological test that can tell us whether someone has a particular mental disorder. As an example, The idea that depressed patients lack serotonin has been convincingly rejected. In fact, some drugs that decrease serotonin also work for depression. For example, tyanepine, and the Irish drug regulator banned GlaxoSmithKline from claiming that paroxetine corrects a chemical imbalance. There is a lot else that speaks against the chemical imbalance hoax. For example, it takes weeks before the drugs work. Psychotropic drugs don't fix a chemical imbalance, they cause it, which is why it is so difficult to come off the drugs again. If taken for more than a few weeks, these drugs create the diseases they were intended to cure. We have turned schizophrenia, ADHD, and depression, which were often self limited diseases in the past, into chronic disorders because of the drugs we use. People may get terrible symptoms when they try to stop, both symptoms that resemble the disease and many others they have never experienced before. It is most unfortunate that all psychiatrists and the patients themselves interpret this as a sign that they still need the drug. They usually don't. They have become dependent, just like a junkie is dependent on heroin or cocaine. And as ADHD drugs and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors have amphetamine effects, we should view these drugs as narcotics on prescription and use them as little as possible. Most psychiatric patients would be better off not receiving drugs at all, and those that need treatment usually only need it for a short time or intermittently. Psychiatrists should consider that other medical specialists, unlike psychiatrists, would be very reluctant to offer long term symptomatic treatment without knowing what lies behind the symptoms. For example, if a patient suffers from nausea or headache. However, it requires strong determination, time, patience, and a tapering period to get patients off the drugs and minimize the withdrawal symptoms. If patients have been on the drugs for years, the tapering period may go up to a full year. Most psychiatrists choose lifelong treatment instead, which is a disaster for many reasons. It keeps the patients locked in the patient role, and the drugs change their personalities so they don't learn to cope with life's challenges. It also seems likely that not only antipsychotics, but all the drugs can cause permanent brain damage and permanent personality changes. For example, with tardive dyskinesia, cognitive decline, and emotional flatness. The brain damage has been shown to occur at receptor level, and there is nothing strange about this, as this is how the brain works. Hashish, LSD, and other brain active substances may also lead to permanent brain damage and psychosis. The fact that psychotropic drugs in the long run create diseases they have a short-term effect on has been brought up again and again over the last 30 to 40 years. But every time, no matter how strong the new evidence, leading psychiatrists have rushed it under the carpet as quickly as possible. It is too painful and too difficult for them to handle. After they put psychoanalysis behind them, which was terribly unscientific, to the point of Sigmund Freud claiming we're homosexuals and that those of us who think otherwise are latent homosexuals. They embraced biological psychiatry, which made their specialty look as scientific as internal medicine, which it isn't. It is unhealthy to perturb normal brain functions with drugs, whether they are legal or illegal. Psychotropic drugs can lead to violence, including murder, and analysis of adverse drug events submitted to the FDA between 2004 and 2009 identified 1,937 cases of violence, 387 of which were homicide. The violence was particularly often reported for psychotropic drugs, antidepressants, sedatives, hypnotics, ADHD drugs, and smoking cessation drug that also affects brain functions. Antidepressants are being suspected of having a causal role in shootings. But when one of the teenage shooters in the Columbine High School massacre was found to have an antidepressant in his blood, the American the American Psychiatric Association immediately denounced the notion that there could be a causal reaction and added that undiagnosed and untreated mental illness exacts a heavy role on those who suffer from these disorders as well as those around them. This is sickening. It's marketing speak and standard industry tactic to blame the disease and not the drug. But this is what psychiatrists routinely do, in particular when patients who try to stop experience with wait a minute. In particular, when patients who try to stop experience withdrawal symptoms, psychotropic drugs, including SSRIs, also increase the risk of traffic crashes. In the United States, people can be prescribed Nuvigil, armodafinil, armodafinil, which is the name implies makes you vigil again. It's approved for shift work disorders. I'm not joking. The drug exists. People who get tired at night shifts now have a disorder. Like so many other psychotropic drugs, Nuvigil has effects like amphetamine and cocaine, so it's yet another narcotic on prescription. And as always, the drug may kill you. It can lead to life threatening rash, Steven Johnson syndrome, fatal multi organ failure, mania, delusions, hallucinations, and suicidal ideation, hospitalization, and a lot else. I'll stick to my coffee, which won't harm me. Screening for psychiatric disorders. As indicated above, the sure way of making us all crazy is to screen for mental disorders. A notorious program in the United States was Teen Screen, which came up with the results that 1 in 5 children suffered from a mental disorder, leading to a flurry of discussions about a crisis in children's mental health. The science related to screening for depression is of appallingly poor quality. For example, only in 5% of studies assessing the false positive and false negative results of screening for depression had the researchers excluded patients who were already diagnosed with depression. This flaw is inexcusable. If you want to know how good ultrasound is to pick up cancers in people who look healthy, you don't study people who have already been diagnosed with large cancers with ultrasound, the very technique you want to test. Despite the fact that the authors of the Cochrane Review on Screening for Depression recommended firmly against screening after having examined 12 trials with 6,000 participants, the Danish authorities, after dutifully quoting the Cochrane Review, recommended screening for various poorly defined risk groups. The test to be used has been recommended by the WHO, but it's so poor that for every 10,000 healthy people screened, there will be 36,000 false positive. Many of these 36,000 will get a prescription for an SSRI. Patients have already created ranging epidemics of psychiatric disorders. Psychiatric diagnoses. But when I point out to them how harmful screening is, they won't listen. What's wrong with psychiatrists? Why aren't they evidence based? If I were to nominate a new psychiatric disorder, it would be ODUFD, Obsessive Denial of Unwelcome Facts Disorder. It's very common among doctors, politicians, and high level administrators, and there is no cure. University administrators are happy to accept enormous gifts from industry at the same time as they implement stringent conflict of interest policies for their faculty and their relationship with commercial sponsors. Unhappy pills. I don't think fraud and lies in research and marketing, corruption of drugs, and the insufficiency of drug regulators have been worse than for the so-called happy pills. The deceptions start already with the name. The term selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, was invented by SmithKline Beecham, which in 2000 merged into GlaxoSmithKline. Unfortunately, it's the official scientific name of this class of drugs, although there is nothing particularly selective about them. There are not they are not particularly specific either. Most substances that affect the brain, including alcohol, are likely to have an effect on depression similar to the effect of those yes, similar to the effect was similar. In a 4-month trial of 156 patients with major depression, the effect was similar for those randomized to exercise as for those who received sertraline, Zoloft. But 6 months later, only 30% of the patients in the exercise group were depressed as compared with 52% in the sertraline group and 55% in a group that was randomized to both exercise and sertraline. These differences were seen despite a low treatment contrast, 64%. Patients in the exercise group were seen despite a low treatment con wait, patients 64% of patients in the exercise group and 60 fuck, I need sunglasses now. Excuse me. Okay, I got them early. These differences were seen despite a low treatment contrast, 64% of patients in the exercise group and 66% in the combination group reported that they continued to exercise, but 48% of the sertraline patients also initiated an exercise program. A Cochrane review of exercise found an effect on depression that was very similar to that reported for SSRIs. A 24-week randomized trial of 375 patients with social phobia found a similar effect of gradual exposure to the feared symptoms as of sertraline. But during an additional 6-month follow up, the exposure group continued to improve, whereas the patients from the sertraline group did not. Social phobia was a rare disease until the drug companies hijacked it and called it social anxiety disorder. They boosted sales tremendously, aided by PR firms and their whores among psychiatrists and patient organizations. The pool of patients went up from about 2% to 13%, or in 1 in every 8 people, handsomely helped by the ludicrous criteria in the DSM that broadened over time. Further lies about happy pills. SmithKline Beacon later merged into GlaxoSmithKline, started marketing paroxetine, Paxil, or Serozat in 1992, and falsely claimed that for the next 10 years that it wasn't habit forming. that was pretty misleading considering that in the original license application, paroxetine led to withdrawal reactions in 30% of the patients. The UK drug regulators also denied there was a problem and failed to warn of the lack of evidence of SSRI effectiveness in mild depression. In 2001, the BBC reported that the World Health Organization had found Paxil to have the hardest withdrawal problems of any antidepressant drug. In 2002, the FDA published a warning, and the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association declared the company guilty of misleading the public about paroxetine on U.S. television. In 2003, Glaxo quietly and in small print reversed its previous estimate of the risk of withdrawal reactions in the prescribing instructions of 0.2% to 25%. Wait a minute. Yeah, 0.2%. A 100 times increase. From 2002 onwards, the BBC presented four documentaries about SSRIs in the Panorama series. The first one called Secrets of Serozat. I recommend everyone with an interest in drugs to see them. I started one evening and couldn't stop until I had seen them all. The journalist Shelley Joffre cleverly exposed that the Glaxo spokesperson, Alistair Benbow, who is a doctor, lied in front of a running camera. For example, he denied that paroxetine could cause suicidality or self-harm, while he sent data to the drug regulator 1 month later that showed exactly this, and which immediately led to a ban on using the drug in children. The drug regulator also lied when it said that this information was completely new to Glaxo, which had known about it for 10 years. In addition, the head of the drug agency echoed the drug company's false assertion that it was the disease, not the drug, that caused the terrible events. U.S. Senator Charles Grassley asked Glaxo for how long the company had known that paroxetine carried a risk of suicide. Glaxo wrote back they detected no signal of any possible association between Paxil and suicidality in adult patients until late February 2006. However, government investigators found that the company had the data back in 1998, and David Healy found evidence in internal company documents that 25% of healthy volunteers experienced agitation and other symptoms of akathisia while taking Paxil. Other studies have found similarly high doses in both children and adults. After the first panorama program, there After the first panorama program, the public was asked to submit emails to the BBC about their experiences with the drug, and 1,374 emails were read by clinical pharmacologist Andrew Herx- Herxheimer, a researcher and researcher Charles Medawar, co-founder of Social Audit. A clear pattern emerged, though Glaxo had fiercely denied that SSRIs cause dependence and can lead to suicide. It was clear that both claims were wrong. It was also clear that the drugs can lead to hostility and murder. For example, after 3 days on paroxetine, he sat up all night forcing himself to keep still because he wanted to kill everyone in the house. The richness of the patient's own report was impressive. For example, many describe electric shock sensations in the head and visual problems when they tried to stop. Such reactions have been coded by the authorities as dizziness and Perth's, I don't know how to say this, paresthesia? I even lost what I was reading. Yeah, paraethsia. The UK drugs regulators' passivity throughout many years made Peter Medawar so frustrated that he suggested that the drug agencies be closed down because they were always the last ones to know about the harms of drugs. Because of the revelations from the patients, the UK Drug Agency now accepts effects reports submitted directly by patients to the agency without having to pass the doctor's obstacles first. After I started to do research on SSRIs, I have regularly appeared in the media about these drugs and have heard many frightening stories. They are remarkably similar, and here is an extract sent to me by a patient who escaped the tyranny of lifelong treatment and incompetent psychiatrists. After a traumatic event, shock, crisis, and depression, I was prescribed happy pills without adequate information about possible side effects. A year later, I asked the psychiatrist to help me stopping the drug as I didn't feel it was helpful. When I left the psychiatrist, she had convinced me that I was undeterred and should have a higher dose. She warned me against stopping the drug as it could lead to chronic depression. During a time when the psychiatrist had long term sick leave, I had the courage, supported by a psychologist, to taper off the drug. I had been on the drug for 3.5 years and had become more and more lethargic and indifferent to everything. It was like escaping from a cheese dish cover. Tapering off is not unproblematic, it gives you a lot of abstinence symptoms. When the psychiatrist returned after her illness, she was insulted about my decision to stop the drug. However, I was much better, and in reply to my question that I was no longer depressed, she said, "I don't know, but if I don't want ha- but if I don't want happy pills, well, then I cannot help you," was the answer. I have not mentioned the name of the drug, but this psychiatrist had a close relationship to the manufacturer of happy pills. People tell me about medical students who are put on happy pills when they have difficulty with their studies, almost always with the fake myth about correcting a chemical imbalance and also comparing this with insulin for diabetes. When the students get abstinence symptoms, when they try to stop, they are told that there is not abstinence, but the disease that has come back and that they likely need the pills for the rest of their life. I must admit that this makes me both angry and terribly sad, particularly because we don't seem to learn anything from history. In the 1880s, the UK government didn't think opium use in India resulted in any injurious consequences. In the 1930s, 4 out of 10 prescriptions contained bromides, and the problem of chronic intoxication wasn't recognized, just as, at the same time, addiction to barbiturates wasn't recognized and doctors pointing out this were ignored. It took 40 years before the addiction problem was finally accepted by the UK Department of Health, and it was realized that the reason people continued with barbiturates indefinitely wasn't that they were ill, but because they couldn't stop without great suffering. In 1995, the United States produced so many barbiturate pills that 7% of the population could eat a pill every day. In the 1960s, the doctors believed that benzodiazepines were harmless and prescribed them for almost anything. At the peak of their use, the sales corresponded to a usage of about 10% of the Danish population, which is extraordinary since the effect disappears after a few weeks because of development of tolerance and because the drugs are highly addictive and have many harms. The trials are the trials are biased, but when used as sleeping pills before tolerance sets in and they still work, the increase in sleeping time is 15 minutes in older people with insomnia, whereas adverse cognitive events are 5 times more common. Adverse psychomotor events 3 times more common, and daytime fatigue 4 times more common. Patients who take such drugs also have a higher risk of falls and motor vehicle crashes, and a study found that the use of benzodiazepines increased the risk of dementia by about 50%. Why should an old person take such a dangerous drug rather than read a book until falling to sleep naturally? The company denies for decades that benzodiazepines cause dependency and got away with it. Although serious dependency was documented already in 1961, it wasn't generally accepted until more than 20 years later. In 1980, the UK drug regulator concluded, based on submitted reports of adverse events to the agency, that only 28 people became dependent on benzodiazepines from 1960 to 1977. We now know the true number is more likely to have been around 500,000 or 20,000 times as many. As doctors and regulators refused to learn from history, I was happy to fund a PhD student who wanted to carry out the research. Why is history repeating itself? A study on benzodiazepines and antidepressants, SSRIs. We found that the definition of substance dependence changed from DSM 3 to the DSM 3R revision that came out in 1987, where the criteria for dependence were narrowed so that they must include also behavioral, psychological, and cognitive manifestations. The substantive claim came about after the recognition of benzodiazepine dependence, and very conveniently just before the SSRIs were marketed in 1988. It was a smokescreen that served to deflect attention from the fact that SSRIs also cause dependence. We found that discontinuation symptoms were described with similar terms for benzodiazepines and SSRIs, and were very similar for 37 of 42 identified symptoms described as withdrawal reactions for SSRIs. To call similar problems for dependence for to call similar problems dependence for benzodiazepines and withdrawal reactions for SSRI is totally irrational. And for the patients, it is just the same. It is very hard for them to stop either type of drug. Another similarly another similarity for the benzodiazepines is that it took the drug agencies many years after they had information before they wanted. Wait a minute. Another similarity to the benzodiazepines is that it took the drug agencies many years after they had the information before they warned about the drugs. The UK regulator misrepresented the data when it described withdrawal. The UK regulator misrepresented the data when it described withdrawal reactions after SSRIs as generally rare and mild. An analysis of the reported adverse events by independent researchers showed that the reactions had been classified as moderate in 60% of the cases and as severe in 20% of the cases in the same UK regulator that announced to the public that they were mild. What they also found was that suicide attempts had often been coded by the companies as non accidental overdose. Just like in the 1960s with benzodiazepines, the company, assisted by their hired psychiatrist opinion leaders and drug regulators suffering from self inflicted blindness, have hooked many millions of patients on drugs most of them didn't need. And when people became abstinent, whether on benzodiazepines or on SSRIs, company tactics were just the same. blame the disease, not the pills. The companies fiercely denied that their SSRIs could lead to dependency, even though they had shown in their own unpublished studies early on that also healthy volunteers become dependent after only a few weeks on the drug. It is truly amazing that the companies have succeeded to such an extent with their deceptions, and shocking that the psychiatrists believed them. SSRIs reduce the number of serotonin receptors in the brain, so when a drug is abruptly removed, the patients will feel badly about it, just like an alcoholic or a smoker will feel terrible if there is no more alcohol or cigarettes around. Therefore, whatever the symptoms are, they cannot be inter- they cannot be interpreted as meaning that the patient is still depressed and in need of the drug. The worst argument I've heard is that the patients are not depressed because they don't crave higher doses. If that were true, smokers are not dependent on nicotine because they don't increase their consumption of cigarettes. It's unbelievable what the nonsense professors of psychiatry have told me in order to maintain the level of self deception in their specialty. The true risk of relapse of depression of a patient who is no longer depressed is small. We can measure how small it is in patients who are no longer depressed and who are no longer depressed is small. We can measure how small it is in patients who are in treatments with the SSRIs, as we have perturbed the normal equilibrium in the brain. However, it is clear that most of the symptoms that occur after abrupt withdrawal of an SSRI aren't depression symptoms, but symptoms of abstinence. Even when slow tapering of SSRIs was attempted after successful behavioral treatment for panic disorder and agoraphobia, which have nothing to do with depression, about half of the patients had withdrawal symptoms. Unfortunately, willing doctors with numerous financial ties to the market of the drugs assist in propagating the delusions in their research. Above all, Stuart Montgomery from the UK, who seems to interpret all withdrawal symptoms as relapse. In 2003, a systematic review at The Lancet reported that 41% relapse when they continued with placebo compared to 18% that continued on active drug. But it's plainly wrong to interpret the symptoms that occur after abrupt drug withdrawal and relapse. Our citizens are drugged to about the same extent today as they were 50 years ago. The decline in the drug use of benzodiazepine of more than 50% has been compensated by a similar increase in the use of SSRIs. SSRIs are used for many of the same conditions as benzodiazepines, and it seems a bit too convenient to me that psychiatrists now say that much of what they previously called anxiety when it was still okay to use benzodiazepines is in really what wait in reality was depression, so that they can now use SSRIs for the same patients. The change in treatment for anxiety disorders from benzodiazepines to SSRIs has happened despite the lack of evidence in support of this change. We have seen a similar explosion in dubious indications for SSRIs as we previously saw for benzodiazepines. And before the barbiturates, although all these drugs are addictive, until 2003, the UK drug regulator propagated the falsehood that SSRIs are not addictive. But the same year, the World Health Organization published a report that noted that three SSRIs, fluoxetine, paroxetine, and sertraline, were among the 30 top highest ranking drugs for which drug dependence had ever been reported. Sales figure 70.1, total sales of scientific neurotransmitter reuptake inhibitors and benzodiazepines and benzodiazepine like drugs, 1970 to 2007, as defined daily doses per 1,000 inhabitants a day. Here's a little chart. Pause to read more. And that's our chapter for today. Bit of a mighty one. What's our next one? Pushing children into suicide with happy pills. Until next time.